It's not showing up. That's not good. Okay, welcome. Welcome to my live stream. I'm just going to be live streaming for about 15 minutes or so today. This is my 500-hour teacher training. I want you to say hello to everybody. Say hi to the world out there. These are the wonderful people in my teacher training here in Asheville, and I'm sorry I didn't get to live stream yesterday. Hi, welcome. So I thought today I would spend a little bit of time just letting you sit in on the class here. So what we're talking about today is the yoga and neuroscience connection. This is not the same as my online course, but I wanted to be able to take a little bit of time today to talk about the way that yoga affects the brain and the nervous system. And the first thing, and so before we get to that, the first thing is we have to look at some of these ideas around yoga. I want to talk about some worldview things and these ideas around yoga because you've seen this many times. In the yoga world, we often confuse yoga practice with exercise. And I think it's really important to make that distinction, because if we don't make that distinction, particularly if we're teaching slow mindful practices, what happens is that people think that we're ripping them off. You know, they should be getting a harder practice. They're not getting a harder practice, and because of it, they think it's not worth it. So I like to break it down between this idea of exercise and exercise. I think this is a useful model to help people understand. Exercise being about fitness or cardiovascular fitness, or improving strength and flexibility. All of those things can be under exercise, and then exercise is really about the nervous system, and that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So with exercise, you're looking at creating better strength, creating more flexibility, maybe more stamina. And what I like to call exercise, it's about activating this tend and befriend response, which is, we'll talk about that more. Does anybody remember where tend and befriend comes from in the nervous system?
The vagus nerve.
Yes. Great. The vagus nerve, right? And do you remember which part of the vagus nerve? Anybody remember? The anterior they talk about, or the ventral vagal. It's the part of the vagus nerve that's above the diaphragm. You remember that? And it's the part of the vagus nerve that connects the muscles in our face to what's going on in your heart and lungs. So I always like to show this one with the ventral vagal by, if you could look at the person next to you and lift your eyebrows and then lift the corners of your mouth. And so the lifting the eyebrows and the lifting the corners of the mouth activates mirror neurons, but it also activates the ventral vagus nerve. It's called the social engagement part of the nervous system. Right, so we get that social engagement part going. That's the tend and befriend part. We can do that when we're with other people, but we can also do that within ourselves. And so yoga practice is a way to activate tend and befriend within ourselves. That's really different than getting a yoga butt. Right? It's a really different goal than try to, look or nail a handstand. It's a different goal. The goal of nervous system, and I call it nervous system resilience. So that means we're kind of opening up that window of tolerance. We're opening up that window of resilience. So tend and befriend, then physiologic balance. We're going to talk a lot more about that this afternoon, what that means. And then looking less towards stamina, more towards better mental health, better self-regulation would be another way to say that. The goal of exercise is cardiovascular fitness. The goal of exercise is nervous system resilience. And I would say that there's something beyond nervous system resilience, the next thing we're going to. Right? For a long time, people talked about stress management. That was a big thing. And nobody's really that interested in stress management or stress resistance, sometimes I would think. And then we started talking about resilience. That seems more interesting. People are more interested in resilience. But actually, there's something beyond resilience, which is self-understanding. And those are the goals of yoga. Right? So what's beyond resilience is understanding who you are, because when you have a sense of who you are, you have a sense of your identity, you have a greater sense of meaning and purpose in your life, then you know what to do with your life. If you know who you are, you know what to do. That's Feldenkrais said that. How do you know who you are? One of the ways we learn who we are is by starting to understand those signals that come from inside, those interoceptive awareness signals. You get a better sense of interoceptive awareness, and that gives us a greater sense of identity. Greater sense of identity, greater sense of meaning and purpose. Greater sense of meaning and purpose, you know what to do in your life. When you know what to do in your life, you're not wandering around in that seeking behavior, which is often associated with addictions and dysfunctional, different kinds of dysfunctional behavior. Everything that teenagers do, basically. Teenagers don't, that's one of the things. Most teenagers, no idea who they are. That's what they're looking for. They're trying to figure it out. Who am I? Who am I? Well, they try, am I that? Am I that? And they, risky behavior, the whole thing. So hopefully we move beyond that developmentally. As you know, and I'll talk about this more in the trauma and addiction weekend, a lot of times we don't know who we are as teenagers, and then we find substances, and the substances give us a reprieve from that hollow feeling of not knowing who we are, that hollow feeling of loss of identity. And if the substances become a problem and turn into substance abuse disorders, what the research says is that people get stuck at that level of development, right? So you get somebody who becomes an opioid addict when they're 15 or 16, and they go through or whatever their substance they're using, or it could be disordered eating, lots of things, and then start working on recovery in their late 20s. Often they'll behave like they're 15 or 16, right? And so that's a developmental, it's something that stops people from developing. So anyway, the good news is that we can get better. Everything can change. So this kind of yoga, I think it's important to create these distinctions. And when we do that, then it helps people to understand that the time they spend practicing slow, internal, mindful movement, the time they spend with you is just as important as the time they spend going to the gym or doing anything else. You can go to the gym and get on your cross trainer and put on your earbuds. My son just got AirPods. Putting in your AirPods, he's so proud of them. And then get on your cross trainer and listen to an Audible or whatever you're listening to, listen to podcasts and get a good workout. And it's good for your body. That is an exercise-based approach. You can do that with yoga. People do it all the time. They go in, someone's got the cool playlist on, and they're doing the vinyasa, and they're like having fun, dancing to it. They don't really have to pay attention. With the difference with exercise practice or this mindful practice is paying attention is most of it. That's what creates the neuroplastic changes in the brain, is the attention. Because now you're taking the front brain. The front brain is the most plastic. Now you're bringing the front brain into the process. And you're increasing attention, you're increasing awareness, you're increasing resilience, you're increasing memory integration. All of these things start to, and connectivity across the hemispheres, all these things start to improve primarily because of awareness, although there's other reasons that they improve too. So it's a different way of using the practice. And when we give these kinds of psychoeducational tools to our students and clients, then they can start to value what they're doing with us, as opposed to thinking it's, yoga light, or, I remember one time I was teaching a retreat. It was before I really understood stuff about the brain. I was at this retreat, and it was like a yoga for detox retreat. So I go in, I'm like going to teach this retreat, and there's this guy in the front of the room, and he's in shorts and nothing else. And he was like, okay, I'm here to detox. And I was like, we're not going to do that kind of yoga. So he stayed for the first practice, and then he left, and he said on the way out, he was like, I'm not staying for this retreat. I need to go do real yoga, So sometimes people have this idea that real yoga means that it's in that left category, that exercise, fitness stuff. And I just think it's important to be really clear. If you want to do exercise, go do exercise. It's great. And if you want to do exercise yoga, go do exercise yoga. Fine. But that's not what we're doing. And it equally has benefits. And so what I hope with this presentation is that you'll see some of these benefits. Okay, so one of the reasons that we get stuck in that trap of thinking about fitness and yoga is because of this scientific materialism, which is something that has been around for about 300, maybe 400 years. It started with Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, and kind of that bifurcation of the body and the mind. So we tend to operate out of a scientific, materialistic worldview. And that worldview is reductive, materialistic, of course. The understanding of who we are as human beings is that as human beings, we're matter, right? And then, unless you multiply yourself by the speed of light, then you're energy. So, but we think of ourselves as matter, as this physical substance that came up from the earth. And so, if we just tweak some chemical here or there with some pharmaceutical, then we'll function better. That's a fundamentally scientific, materialistic worldview, and it doesn't take into account other worldviews that say, well, maybe, like Deepak Chopra always says, no, you're not a human being having a spiritual experience. You're a spiritual being having a human experience. That's a different worldview. And that worldview, and if it comes down to worldview, because unless and until we challenge our worldviews, we continue to operate out of this paradigm. And by the way, if this paradigm was accurate, then you could take the pill and everything would be better. But because, the prescriptions for antidepressants, for example, have skyrocketed. When I first started teaching about yoga for depression, I think the prescriptions were at 50 million prescriptions a year for antidepressants. And that number has tripled, I think. Quadrupled, perhaps. I could be getting this all wrong, but it's in that ballpark. And so it's like Abraham Maslow said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? So you keep hammering at the problem with a pharmaceutical, and you keep coming short of getting the right answer. You're not solving the problem. Why are we not solving the problem of depression, for example? Why are we not solving the problem of addiction? There's a lot of medication-assisted recovery right now. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. But that to go down that rabbit hole is saying, like, human beings just have something wrong with their brains, and we're going to fix what's wrong with their brains with chemicals. If that was true, then we would have much more success. And we don't have a lot of success in terms of treating addiction or chronic pain or depression. And mostly it's because we keep going to this worldview. We keep saying human beings are primarily matter. And if we can fix this problem, if we can fix this material object with the right chemical or the right surgery or whatever, then everything will be better. But that is like just hammering the nails. It's basically not looking that we have other problems, we have other ways of solving problems. We are fundamentally not just material beings. We're much more complicated. So the new gold standard is the biopsychosocial spiritual model. It's not really new, it's been around since the 70s, but that's the gold standard for treating addiction, for treating chronic pain, for treating chronic illnesses. And yet Western science has a very difficult time trying to figure out how to incorporate that model because of this world, because we haven't changed the worldview. We still keep coming at it from this scientific materialism. So, the idea is like, here you've got a mind. We know the mind and the brain are different things. But a lot of people say the mind and the brain are the same thing, and that the mind is just what happens because you have a brain. It's an epiphenomenon of the brain. And consciousness, well, we can't really talk about that. The soul, well, we could talk about that before brunch on Sundays, but it doesn't have anything to do with what's going on the rest of the week. It doesn't have anything to do with our worldview for the rest of the week. We know these things aren't entirely true, but the Western mind tends to default to this worldview, and it's part of the reason that we have had very limited success dealing with the diseases of the 21st century, the 20th and the 21st century, right? The diseases of the 19th century were communicable diseases: measles, mumps, rubella, polio. We dealt with that stuff. And then the diseases of the 20th century became chronic lifestyle diseases, and those things we have not dealt with. We haven't figured out how to deal with them. Oh, hi, Missy. I'm going to read your And Missy just wrote a note. She wrote, at the chronic pain conference I just attended, a pharmacist stated that depression is the #1 consumer of healthcare dollars. Yeah. And the World Health Organization also said depression is the #1 cause of disability in the world, right? So it's a huge pressing problem. Okay, so yoga has different ways of knowing and different ways of understanding who we are, different worldviews, I would say. The yoga worldview is more synthetic and holistic as opposed to materialistic and reductive, right? So we're not just breaking things down into parts, we're seeing how things fit together. Also, causality is consciousness or spirit rather than physical matter. So you could say the Western worldview is you're a human being having a spiritual experience. The Eastern worldview is you're a spiritual being having a human experience. I mean, that's a kind of a simple way to break down those differences in worldviews. And then, of course, we have this idea of shariras. We've talked about those, right? That there's the subtle body, well, actually the causal body, karana sharira, and then the subtle body, shukshma, and then the physical body, the stula sharira. So those three bodies, right? The physical body emanates from the scaffolding or the blueprint, which is the subtle body, so by the way, the subtle body is not in the physical body. The physical body is in the subtle body. Chakras are not in your body. Your body is in your chakras. Different way of thinking about it, right? And then where does it come from? It comes out of some kind of a longing that we have to individually as jivas, perhaps, and there's the Shiva and the Jiva, or there's the Purusha and the Parama Purusha. They're different depending on the philosophy. It depends on what is the desire of that individual, and how is that desire expressed in the universe. That's why we come into creation. That's the ontological explanation from the tradition. Of course, there's there's different parts of that tradition, but basically, that's the discussion of why we're here. And so, in that discussion of the three bodies, the spirit is the cause of mind, and mind is the cause of matter. So, not your physical body makes a brain, and then your mind comes out of your brain. But your mind creates a physical body and has to house a sophisticated neuroendocrine structure that can express your desires to actualize whatever it is you have to in your life. Like your physical body is the expression of what the desire of your soul. You can think of it that way. Which I think that does a lot to kind of, I don't know, for me that does a lot about body image issues. Like your physical body is that manifestation of some kind of deep desire of your soul. I think that's a very interesting way to look at our bodies. And instead of the bodies being something to subdue and to, punish, think about some of that way that we think of physical fitness about the body, like control the body, subdue the body, punish the body. And then what if we flip that on its head and we were allowing the body, connecting to the body, tending and befriending to the body, listening to the body, and how that is kind of the causal pathway that yoga shows us of what we are as human beings. The body is a manifestation, so the body has a lot of things to share with us. It can change our relationship to our body to change the worldview. Changing the worldview changes everything. So this is these are the three bodies from the tradition. That's from the Upanishads, by the way. That's where that comes from. Okay, so similarly, the way that we have, the way that I want to say something about how in the way that we can change the way we think about who we are as human beings, and that we can start to change the worldview, the way we look at ourselves. There's been changes that have been happening all around us in terms of science, and that's really exciting. Like the scientists are changing too, And one of the shifts, I want to talk about the shift in neuroscience, because we used to have, there was a dominant paradigm of neuroscience, and now there's this emerging paradigm. So the dominant paradigm of science was reductive. It was, here's this part of your brain, that is over here, that controls language. And here's this part of your brain where all the memories are, and here's this part of your brain where you do computing, you know. And now we're looking at, no, your whole brain is working all the time. You know, even there, so this movie I saw in 2014 with, what's her name, Scarlett Johansson. It was called Lucy. It wasn't that good of a movie, but it was kind of a weird movie. It was just like a Scarlett Johansson vehicle movie. But it was all about how we only use 10% of our brain. And they figured out how she could use all of her brain. That is so old. Like, I can't believe that made it into a movie in 2014. Because we're using all of our brain all the time. It's not that we only use 10% of our brain. Like, what would the rest of that be doing in there? You know? In fact, the human brain, one thing that's different about the human brain is that our head, that's one of the reasons that we have so much difficulty having birth, because our heads are so big compared to our craniums are big compared to the rest of the body. We have a lot of dense neuromatter. We have a lot of dense neurons and lots of folds in the brain, so that's one of the reasons we're able to think more and do more, and you know, we've been able to create more. You know, I have to say that the reason, the evolutionary reason that human beings are considered like more intelligent than a lot of animals, which I think that's up for question, I'm not saying that, but you know, in general, is because of women, because we figured out how to cook. I'm saying it's because of women, because I feel like women need a little bit more credit. And so what happens when you cook? You make the calories more bioavailable. And the brain takes 25 to 30% of all the calories that you take in. So if you're constantly eating raw food, and you think about this, our evolutionary past, like apes eating raw food, they couldn't develop their brains as much as human beings were able to, because it just was too many, you know, it was too hard to get enough calories to develop the brain. So human beings, because of cooking, learned to assimilate more food. That's why I'm saying, like, we got to give credit to the women here. Learned how to digest their food better, and that evolutionarily led us to the development of bigger brains. That's what they're saying right now. This comes from Susanna. I can't remember how to say her last name. Hermes Herculano, I think. She's this brilliant Brazilian neuroscientist who, you know, for a long time they've said that we had 100 million neurons in the brain. And she was like, that can't be right. And so she figured out how to count the neurons in the brain by making brain soup. She figured out how to, it's so interesting, these people. She figured out how to use formaldehyde to preserve the neurons, and then make some kind of a slushy out of it, and then count the neurons that were in that slushy, and then that's how she figured out there were 86 billion neurons in the brain. And then she also figured out why human beings have more computational power and bigger cerebrums, you know, the front brain, and that was because of cooking. Isn't that exciting? Because we learned how to use more of our calories from food, because, as I said, the brain takes 25 to 30% of all the calories. So anyway, I just think it's a very interesting theory. And other animals maybe have bigger, like elephants and whales obviously have bigger brains, but not as much computational power. There's some articles about, and she's got a good, it was either a TED Talk or a YouTube video too, so you can watch a little bit more about her. Okay, so the paradigm that's changing in terms of neuroscience, we had more of a reductive kind of dominant paradigm, and then the emerging paradigm is systems thinking. And so thinking about the whole brain as a system rather than these separate parts that do different things. That's starting to change. So we can't just say the hippocampus does memory and the amygdala does smoke detector, fear monitoring. Like, there's so much more going on than that. But it's still useful to think about things in terms of which parts of the brain are doing what. We'll talk about that more today. But the paradigm is starting to change. The dominant paradigm was the brain is fixed. You remember those commercials from when you were in high school? This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? Remember that commercial? That's not true. You don't fry your brain cells. You actually, neurogenesis is possible. We can always create more brain cells. I think you talked about that with Margaret a little bit this morning. And this idea that during pregnancy, women's brains can grow. It's fascinating.
Although sniffing glue, you're probably going to regenerate those.
Yes. Well, there is. It's true. There are some substances that create permanent brain changes that may or may not be overcomable. Yeah, and there's also injuries, brain injuries, that can create problems too. But there are things that can change in the brain. So brain is fixed, and then the emerging paradigm is neuroplasticity. The idea that there's specialized areas of the brain that perform specialized functions. Now we're moving to the whole brain is participating in everything through neural networks. And then brain-centric is the other thing. You know, how many times have you seen the brain floating in the liquid in the lab of the scientists, right? And just cut right off at the brainstem. And now we're seeing that there are neurons. The brainstem goes deep down into the spinal cord, and everything is connected. So you can't just have a brain. You know, you can't do Frankenstein yet, where you just take a brain and put it into a different body. Yeah, should. I knew you wanted to. But
brain, the center of the chain.
It's not just brain-centric. Now we're looking at how is the brain embodied? And this is what's so exciting about yoga, that we can affect the brain through movement, through breathing practices. So many ways we can affect the brain. And there was a neurotransmitter or a bias that's chemical, saying like, okay, serotonin does this in your system, or dopamine does something else in your system. All of that is not necessarily wrong, but to say serotonin is the happiness chemical, serotonin is also involved in learned helplessness. You know, that doesn't sound so happy. So there's, you know, it's a little reductive to say, oh, dopamine is about curiosity and seeking behavior, and serotonin is about happiness, and endorphins are about pain. You know, those things, they're involved in it, but it's not that reductive. So we've gone from, and by the way, that's chemical. But the brain is working electrically all the time as well through what are called the glial cells. Glial cells are pretty exciting and not very well understood yet. Every neuron has a glial cell, and they think, oh, the glial cells just support the neurons. Well, that's because that's all we knew about was the neurons. We don't really understand what the glial cells are doing, but I think when we find out, it's going to be really exciting. And it has something to do with energy and fascia and Reiki. I don't know. You know, it has to do with things that we don't really understand yet. You know, and I think when we figure out what's going on with glial cells, it's going to be exciting. So yoga gives us a sort of, like I talked about the scientific worldview, the yoga worldview, how those things are influencing each other for sure. And yoga kind of offers a holistic perspective on human existence. As advances are made in neuroscience that enable us to better understand the mechanisms behind why yoga practices work. That's an exciting change. And for me, that's been revolutionary in terms of being able to teach yoga and help people understand why slow mindful movement is just as important as cardiovascular exercise. For me, this is just, studying the brain has changed everything for me. And the potential for this study, I would suggest, is both broad and deep. And we're just getting started because the brain is complicated, to say the least. And I'll show you a quote about that. But we're really just getting started. We're just at the beginning of the bell curve in terms of understanding the brain. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about classical yoga and how this is related to the brain. Let me see. Stability, homeostasis. So let me go back to these. So these are the first two Yoga Sutra 2 and 3. So Yoga Sutra 2 is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which means something like yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. But I think it's really insufficient to talk about the definition of yoga from the Yoga Sutras without mentioning Yoga Sutra 3. The Yoga Sutra 2 says yoga is about the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. Why do you want to do that? Because then when you stop the mind, then you get clearer about who you are. You can rest in your knowledge, right? Tada drastu swarupe avastanam. That means, okay, so I stop the mind so I know who I am, so myself can be revealed. It's a process, right? It's not just stop the mind for no reason. It's just this, that's my whole gripe with mindfulness. You know, mindfulness is great. But in and of itself, if you don't know what you're being mindful of or why you're using mindfulness, it's an ineffectual tool. I'm sorry. It has to be contextualized. To know why you're using mindfulness. Be more aware of my values. Great. You know, and of my actions so that I can be in line with my values. Great, because that's pointing to identity. Without this sense of identity, we don't have a sense of meaning and purpose. We don't have a sense of what to do. So that's what the yoga, it bothers me when people talk about mindfulness in a vacuum. And it bothers me when people talk about yoga as just stopping your mind. Because it doesn't point to the deeper goals of the practice, which are self-understanding, self-realization, an emergence of identity. So we can break these down into, we want to get stable. There's stability. When there's stability in the system, homeostasis in the system, that leads us to understanding. So we want to create a stable container, because stability is where the self emerges from. And you think about this culture that we live in where they're just so unstable, and people are on their screens, and there's constant change and motion and movement, and we have difficult time to finding stability. So mindfulness is that tool that helps us to get stable. When we get stable, the self becomes more emergent, you know. Okay, so stability leads to understanding. So I hope that makes sense in terms of when we're going to talk about the nervous system now, we're going to create that stability in order for identity to emerge. So a couple things about yoga, the mind and the brain. The brain's an organ. It's made of organic material. It's not the same thing as the mind. The mind is very hard to pin down scientifically. There's a few people that try to create definitions of it, like Dan Siegel tries to create a definition of the mind, which might be useful, but it's definitely different than the brain. And the relationship between the mind and the brain is hotly debated. Like, for example, a lot of neuroscientists will say the mind is what the brain does, which I think is an insufficient definition. Or you'll hear mind is the software, brain is the hardware. I've heard that one too. I would suggest, and this is from Dan Siegel, because Dan Siegel says the mind uses the brain to change the mind. I would say no, the mind uses the brain and the body to change the mind, because the body is involved in that changing process. Okay, so we're going to start talking about yoga and neuroscience, but I am going to say goodbye to the live stream folks now. Thank you for being here. And does everybody want to say goodbye? Say goodbye. Bye, everyone. It's been really nice having you, but I got to go back and focus on the group. So thanks, and I'll be back next week. Bye.